In the winter of 1965, a strange and tense scene unfolded in the harbor of New York City. A French naval vessel arrived not to visit and not to threaten war, but to conduct a business transaction that would shake the foundations of the global economy. The ship was there to collect gold, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of solid gold bars. This was not a robbery, it was a bank run. But the depositor was not a panicked citizen standing in line outside a local branch. The depositor was the Republic of France, and the bank was the United States of America. Inside the White House, President Lyndon Baines Johnson was furious. He reportedly called the French President Charles de Gaulle an ungrateful old man. He viewed this act as a betrayal, a stab in the back from an ally that the United States had liberated just 20 years earlier. But in Paris, Charles de Gaulle sat calmly in the Élysée Palace. He did not see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a whistleblower. He believed he was the only world leader brave enough to point out the naked truth that the emperor had no clothes, or rather that the United States had no gold. This event, known as the Gold War, was the moment the post-World War II economic order began to crumble. It was the moment when the promise that the US dollar was as good as gold was tested and found wanting. To understand why France sent warships to attack the US dollar, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944. The story begins at Bretton Woods. As the Second World War was drawing to a close, the Allied nations gathered to decide how the world economy would work when the fighting stopped. They wanted to prevent another Great Depression. They wanted stability. The United States held all the cards. At that moment, America had the only functioning industry left on Earth. It had the strongest military, and crucially, it held 2/3 of all the gold in the world. The American delegates proposed a system that seemed logical at the time. They said, let us make the US dollar the center of the universe. Every other currency, the French franc, the British pound, the German mark, would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. It was a brilliant system. It gave the world confidence. If you held a US dollar anywhere in the world, from Tokyo to Rio, you knew it was not just a piece of paper, it was a claim check. You could in theory walk into the US Treasury and trade that paper for shiny yellow metal. The United States promised to exchange dollars for gold on demand for any central bank. It was the gold standard, but with an American middleman. For 20 years, this system worked beautifully. It fueled the greatest economic boom in human history. Europe rebuilt itself from the rubble. Japan rose from the ashes. Trade flowed freely across the oceans. The dollar was king and everyone wanted it. But there was a flaw in the system, a fatal flaw that only a few economists and one stubborn French general saw coming. The flaw was simple math. As the world economy grew, countries needed more and more dollars to conduct trade. To meet this demand, the United States had to print more dollars. This was fine as long as the US had enough gold to back them up. But by the 1960s, the United States was printing dollars much faster than it was mining gold. The printing presses were running hot to pay for the Cold War, to pay for bases in Germany and Japan, to pay for aid to developing nations, and most expensively, to pay for a growing war in the jungles of Vietnam and a massive welfare state at home known as the Great Society. The United States was acting like a wealthy man who writes checks to everyone he meets. Everyone takes the checks because they believe he is rich. But if everyone tried to cash those checks on the same day, they would realize the account is overdrawn. This is where Charles de Gaulle enters the story. De Gaulle was a giant of history. He was the man who had led the Free French forces against the Nazis. He was a man of immense pride and a deep suspicion of what he called the Anglo-Saxon powers, meaning the United States and Britain. De Gaulle believed that a nation without total independence was not a nation at all. He hated the idea that France had to rely on the United States for its defense or its economy. In the early 1960s, his financial advisors began to show him some disturbing numbers. They showed him that the United States was running a massive balance of payments deficit. They explained that American corporations were buying up French companies like Ford, buying French car makers, or IBM taking over French computer firms. But they were buying these real assets with paper dollars that were printed out of thin air. De Gaulle was outraged. He called this the exorbitant privilege. He argued that the United States had a superpower that no other nation had. If France wanted to buy oil or steel, it had to earn dollars by selling wine or cars. It had to work for its money. But if the United States wanted to buy something, it just printed more green paper. It was a free lunch on a global scale. De Gaulle saw this not just as unfair economic competition, but as a form of imperialism. He believed the US was conquering the world not with soldiers, but with inflation. The tipping point came in 1965. The United States was escalating the war in Vietnam. The cost was astronomical. The U.S. Federal Reserve was pumping money into the system to keep interest rates low and the economy booming. Inflation was starting to tick up. De Gaulle realized that the U.S. dollar was effectively overvalued. It was trading at $35 an ounce of gold, but there were so many dollars in circulation that the real value was much lower. He realized that the United States was essentially bankrupt in terms of gold. It had promised to pay gold for every dollar, but it had issued far more claims than it had assets. It was the world's biggest Ponzi scheme, and de Gaulle decided it was time to cash out. He did not do this quietly. De Gaulle was a master of political theater. On February 4th, 1965, he called a press conference at the Élysée Palace. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. De Gaulle sat under the crystal chandeliers wearing his military uniform. He spoke in his slow, deep voice. He delivered a lecture on the history of money. He told the world that gold was the only true money. He said, "Gold has no nationality. It is eternally and universally accepted. It is unalterable fiducially." He declared that the time of the dollar's dominance was over. He announced that from this day forward, France would no longer accept vague promises from the United States. France would exercise its right under the Bretton Woods Agreement. It would take its reserves of US dollars, hundreds of millions of them, and it would send them back to the US Treasury. And in exchange, it demanded the gold. This announcement sent shockwaves through the financial world. It was a declaration of financial war. De Gaulle was effectively calling America's bluff. He was shouting fire in a crowded theater. He knew that if other countries followed France's lead, the US gold supply would vanish in days. The reaction in Washington was a mixture of disbelief and panic. President Johnson tried to downplay the threat. He sent diplomats to Paris to talk de Gaulle out of it. They argued that this would destabilize the West. They argued that it would help the Soviet Union. They appealed to the friendship between the two nations. But de Gaulle was unmoved. He famously said that treaties are like young girls, and roses, they last while they last. The time of the dollar standard had passed. The French government began the logistics of the transfer. This was not a digital transaction where numbers move on a screen. This was 1965. It was a physical operation. The Bank of France gathered pallets of US dollar bills. They notified the US Federal Reserve of their intention to redeem. The United States had no legal choice but to comply. If they refused, they would be admitting that the dollar was worthless, and the entire global financial system would collapse instantly. So the U.S. Treasury opened the vaults at Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. They began to load heavy bars of gold onto trucks. These bars were standard delivery bars, 400 ounces of pure 24-karat gold. They were driven to the docks and loaded onto ships. It is a striking image to imagine. In an era of nuclear submarines and jet aircraft, the fate of the world economy depended on heavy crates of metal moving slowly across the Atlantic Ocean. The French Navy was involved to ensure the security of the shipment. This was the national wealth of France being repatriated. De Gaulle wanted the gold in Paris in the vaults of the Banque de France, where he could touch it. He did not trust the Americans to hold it for him. He believed that possession was the only law that mattered. As the first shipments of gold arrived in French ports, the American media turned on France. They boycotted French wine. They poured champagne into the gutters. They called the French ungrateful. But de Gaulle did not care about popularity. He cared about reality. And the reality was that the American gold supply was bleeding dry. In 1945, the U.S. held 20,000 tons of gold. By 1965, that number had dropped significantly. And now, with France taking huge chunks every month, the drain was accelerating. Other nations began to watch nervously. Germany, Japan, and Spain all held massive reserves of U.S. dollars. They were loyal allies of the United States, and they relied on U.S. military protection. They were afraid to anger Washington, but they were also afraid of being the last one holding the bag. If France took all the good assets, what would be left for them? A quiet run on the bank began. Central banks started to covertly exchange their dollars for gold, trying not to make a scene like de Gaulle, but trying to protect themselves nonetheless. The pressure on the London gold pool, which was a mechanism used by Western nations to suppress the price of gold, became unbearable. The market price of gold wanted to go up, but the U.S. government was selling gold to keep it at $35. They were bleeding reserves to maintain a fantasy. De Gaulle's attack was not just about economics. It was a geopolitical maneuver. He wanted to break the American hegemony over Europe. He wanted Europe to be independent, a third pole in the Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR. He saw the dollar as the chain that bound Europe to American foreign policy. By breaking the dollar, he hoped to free Europe. He was particularly critical of the Vietnam War. He believed the war was unjust and doomed to failure. He argued that Europe was indirectly paying for the bombing of Vietnam because the U.S. printed money to pay for the bombs, and Europe absorbed that inflation by holding the dollars. By demanding gold, he was effectively defunding the American war machine. The tension mounted throughout the late 60s. The U.S. government tried everything to stop the bleeding. They imposed capital controls, preventing American citizens from investing abroad. They tried to discourage tourism to keep dollars at home. They pressured allies like Germany to sign agreements, promising not to convert their dollars for gold. The German chancellor famously received a letter from the U.S. threatening to withdraw American troops from Germany if they redeemed their dollars. It was essentially a protection racket. We will defend you from the Soviets, but you must hold our depreciating currency. Germany folded. France did not. By 1968, the situation was critical. The United States had lost more than half of its gold reserves since the end of World War II. The vaults were emptying at an alarming rate. The French had successfully repatriated tons of gold. The American public was starting to get nervous. There was talk of a dollar crisis. The price of imports was rising. The inflation that de Gaulle had warned about was arriving in American cities. The first part of de Gaulle's plan had worked perfectly. He had exposed the weakness of the dollar. He had proven that the emperor had no clothes. He had moved the physical wealth of the West from New York to Paris, but he had also unleashed forces that he could not control. He had started a fire that would eventually burn down the entire house of Bretton Woods. The system was cracking. The markets were smelling blood. The speculators were gathering. And in the White House, a new president was about to take office. Richard Nixon was watching the gold drain with a cold, calculating eye. He knew the game was up. He knew the United States could not keep paying gold forever. He realized he would have to make a choice between saving the dollar's reputation or saving the American economy. And, unlike the diplomats of the past, Nixon was not afraid to flip the table over. The stage was set for the final collapse. The ships had sailed. The gold was in Paris. The dollars were flooding back to America, causing inflation. The trap that de Gaulle had sprung was closing tight around the U.S. economy. But the Americans had one final card to play, a card that would change the nature of money itself forever. De Gaulle wanted a return to the gold standard. He wanted honest money. But the United States was about to give the world something very different. They were about to sever the link between money and reality entirely. The Gold War was about to turn into a fiat revolution. By the summer of 1971, the financial war that Charles de Gaulle had launched with his press conference 6 years earlier had reached a boiling point. The physical transfer of gold from the United States to France had bled the American treasury dry. The visuals of French ships loaded with bullion sailing away from New York were a humiliation that the American superpower could no longer tolerate. But de Gaulle's bold gamble had done more than just embarrass the Americans. It had triggered a global loss of confidence. The secret was out. The United States did not have enough gold to cover its debts. The run on the bank was no longer just a French operation. It had gone global. In London, the British government was quietly panicking. They saw the same numbers the French saw. The British ambassador approached the U.S. Treasury with a polite but devastating request. They wanted to convert $3 billion of their reserves into gold. They wanted to do it quietly to avoid a panic, but the sheer size of the request was the final straw. It was the equivalent of a third of the remaining U.S. gold stock. If the United States paid the British, there would be almost nothing left. The vault at Fort Knox would be essentially empty. The American dollar, which was the foundation of global commerce, would be revealed as worthless paper. Richard Nixon was now the President of the United States. Nixon was not a man who cared deeply about economic theory. He cared about power, and he cared about winning the next election. He looked at the situation and saw a trap. If he kept playing by the rules of Bretton Woods, the United States would go bankrupt. He would have to induce a massive recession at home to stop the inflation. He would have to cut spending on the Vietnam War. He would have to cut social programs. It would be political suicide. Nixon realized that the United States was being constrained by the very system it had created. The promise to pay gold was a chain around the neck of the American economy. So Nixon decided to break the chain. He decided to do something that no major power had ever done in peacetime. He decided to default on the most important financial promise in the world. He gathered his top advisors at Camp David, a secluded presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. It was a secret meeting. The world press did not know it was happening. Nixon's team, including his Treasury Secretary John Connally, debated the options. The traditional economists argued that they must save the gold standard. They argued that cutting the link to gold would destroy the dollar's credibility. They warned of chaos. But Connally, a tough-talking Texan, famously told the Europeans effectively that the dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. He argued for the nuclear option. Close the gold window, stop the shipments, tell France and Britain and the world to get lost. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted the wildly popular television show Bonanza to address the nation. He looked into the camera and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in economic history. He spoke about defending the dollar against international speculators. He blamed faceless financial forces for the crisis. And then, buried in the middle of the speech, he dropped the bombshell. He announced that he had directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. He used the word temporarily. It was a lie. The gold window would never open again. The Nixon shock, as it came to be known, was an earthquake. In Paris, the French government was stunned. They had won the argument, but they had lost the war. De Gaulle had died the previous year, but his successors watched in horror as the United States simply changed the rules of the game. France had bet that gold was the ultimate money, and that the U.S. would be forced to discipline itself to protect its gold reserves. Instead, the U.S. simply declared that gold no longer mattered. They declared that the dollar was money simply because the United States said it was. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The currency markets shut down. Traders didn't know how to price anything. When they reopened, the value of the dollar plummeted against the French franc, the German mark, and the Japanese yen. This meant that American goods became cheaper and foreign goods became more expensive. It was a massive devaluation that hurt Europe and helped American manufacturers. It was exactly what Nixon wanted. But for the French, who were sitting on piles of gold bars in Paris, it was a bitter-sweet victory. Yes, they had their gold. And yes, the price of gold skyrocketed. In the years following, the Nixon shock gold went from $35 an ounce to over $800 an ounce. The French treasury made a fortune on paper. De Gaulle's decision to buy gold looked like a stroke of genius. He had traded depreciating paper for an asset that exploded in value. However, the deeper goal of de Gaulle had failed. He had wanted to force the United States to be responsible. He had wanted to return the world to a system of honest money where nations could not print their way out of debt. Instead, his attack had forced the U.S. to sever the last link to reality. The world moved from a gold standard to a fiat standard. In this new world, the United States did not need gold at all. It could print as many dollars as it wanted, and the world had no choice but to accept them because there was no alternative. The dollar remained the world reserve currency not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by the U.S. military and the U.S. economy. The consequences of this shift are still with us today. The inflation of the 1970s was a direct result of this decoupling. Without the discipline of gold governments around the world began to print money to solve every political problem. The era of stable prices was over. The era of constant inflation had begun. For France, the Gold War was the last great act of defiance by a European power against American hegemony. It was the last time a Western ally dared to look Washington in the eye and say no. The ships that carried the gold across the Atlantic were the final convoy of an older world. A world where money was physical, where debts had to be paid, and where a promise written on paper was expected to be honored. The legacy of this event is profound. It taught the world that the United States would always act in its own self-interest, even if it meant breaking its own treaties. It taught developing nations that holding dollar reserves was a risk because the rules could change overnight. And it validated the cynicism of Charles de Gaulle, who always believed that nations have no friends, only interests. In the end, the Gold War was a battle between two philosophies. The philosophy of gold, represented by France, which valued stability, history, and tangible assets. And the philosophy of the dollar, represented by the United States, which valued flexibility, growth, and the power of the state to manage the economy. The United States won the geopolitical battle. The dollar remained king, but France won the moral argument. The instability, the debt crises, and the inflation that have plagued the global economy since 1971 are the direct result of ignoring the warning that de Gaulle delivered in that press conference. Today, the gold that France repatriated still sits in the deep vaults of the Banque de France in Paris. It is one of the largest gold reserves in the world. It sits there as a silent monument to the time when France forced the United States to pay its debts. It is a reminder of the brief moment when a French president sent his navy to New York not to conquer territory but to capture the truth. The ships have long since been scrapped. The politicians are dead. But the gold remains, eternal, unalterable, and indifferent to the paper promises of empires. The Gold War is over, but the question it asked remains unanswered. What is money really? Is it a promise from a government, or is it a cold, hard piece of metal that owes nothing to anyone? Charles de Gaulle made his choice, and looking at the mountain of debt the world sits on today, it is hard to say he was wrong. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. Thanks for watching.